Thank you very much, all of you, for coming. This evening is brought to you on behalf of BCASCD, and I'm Judy Robb. I'm the president this year of BCASCD. That lengthy set of initials stands for the British Columbia affiliate of ASCD, who you probably know best for publishing Education Leadership magazine. So we're the British Columbia affiliate of that international association, and we're a group of about 350 classroom teachers, district principals, school-based principals, who are working together to bring you affordable professional development activities and professional dialogue. This is the third or fourth year that we've had a dinner meeting in January where we have engaged in professional dialogue both through the speakers and through conversations we have had afterwards, and we're very excited about the evening tonight. Right now, I'd just like to thank everybody from the BCASCD executive who've worked very hard to put on this evening, and will you please stand and be recognized? Every year when people come to this January meeting, they are expecting a book. So where, you might ask, is the book for this year? It's caught in a snowstorm somewhere in Texas or an ice storm, after which it has to come up through customs, and so the book did not make it, even though all of us did. But we have all of your names, and we have your school districts or places of business, and so when the book does arrive, this being the book, Results Now by Mike Schmoker, we will get it to you through your school district or through the mail. So you will be receiving that in the next week or two. We have an exciting evening planned for you. And this evening we have speakers with our debate. We have Mr. Peter Cowley, the Director of School Performance Studies for the Fraser Institute, Dr. Paul Shaker, the Dean of Education at Simon Fraser University. They will be our speakers in the debate, which is being moderated by Mr. Ron Rubidoux, the retired superintendent from Kelowna. At this time, Ron will explain to you how the debate format will work, and we will begin.
Thank you. And good evening and welcome to the great debate. The title of the debate tonight is How Should We Measure Our Schools? I was chosen to moderate this because I live a long ways away. I'm old and retired and will die soon. And I have this really large, obnoxious watch. And we're going to use this watch because it's a great countdown timer. So here's our debate format. I'm going to throw a question to one of our participants. They have 5 minutes to respond to the question. I will now give then a rebuttal to the opposite side. We'll follow by 2 minutes of follow-up on that particular issue. I will use a variety of subtle hand signs to indicate when it's time to give it up. I apologize already because this is a complex topic. 5 minutes will not do justice. I have a series of 5 questions which only I know, and I will use my whim to change them if necessary, because it's just possible that questions 2, 3, and 4 that I prepared may be answered right off the bat. At the conclusion of the formal questions, we're going to provide an opportunity for the audience to ask questions. They will be brief to the point, and they will come to the speaker's mic, and will be about 15 or 20 minutes of those questions. So let's begin. Just before we started, I threw a loonie in the air and chose the starting side. We're going to start with Mr. Cowley. And the first question, should we measure schools and why?
Schooling is a service that schools provide to their students, and through the students, I suppose, to the parents and to society. Every school has or should have a mission statement. And that's an expression of what it is that the school is intended to do. And how do we know whether or not that mission is fulfilled? Well, we have to find some measure of whether or not that which we plan to do had been done. Now, why would we do that? Well, the first thing is to know that we're successful. I mean, if a school sets out to build good citizens, then it seems to me pretty obvious that we should determine whether or not that is in fact what they're doing. So measurement for the purposes of ensuring that we are doing what we say we're doing is important. But then also, and this is critically important as well, without measurement, we don't know whether or not we're doing as well this year as we did last year. We don't have the capacity to set baselines for improvement so that we will do better the next year. Finally, with regard to measurement, and this has to do with particularly with the report card, there are a number of different stakeholders, a number of different interested parties, as it were, in every school. There are those who work there. There are the people who are taught there. There are the parents of those students. And there are the people, in the cases of the public schools, there are the people who pay the bill to a certain extent, the taxpayers. Each one of those constituents has not only an interest, but I would say an obligation to know how the particular school unit is doing. And in order to do that, we have to have some kind of objective measures and reporting that will allow all those stakeholders to have access to the same kind of results that everyone else does. You know, the interesting thing about the report card, I was involved in my daughter's school consultative committee, we called it in Vancouver in those days. It was 1993. And none of the data that is used in the report card was available to parents at that time. In fact, none of us at this particular school knew of its existence. Now, this information was generated by the Ministry of Education. It was delivered by the ministries to school boards across the province. It was at the determination of those individual school boards what further distribution of those results was made. But certainly in my school, the school my daughter was in, we, as I say, didn't even know those results existed. Once we did know, as a result of the judicious placing of a report on a table by a sympathetic teacher, once we did know, it confirmed some concerns that we had about individual results at that school. And it allowed us, and this is critical, and we'll be speaking about this more as the evening goes on, I'm sure, it allowed us as parents to compare how one school was doing, ours, the one that we were most interested in, and the others around, nearby, and in the same school district. So I'm probably getting pretty close to the 5 minutes, but I would suggest that determination as to whether or not we're meeting the mission, capacity to determine whether or not we're improving on a regular basis, and reporting to all those who have a right to hear how we as a school are doing are the three key elements in answer to the question, why should we measure schools?
4.
More time for questions.
You're not going to explode, are you?
No. Here's 5 minutes.
Well, we're a human service profession in education. That's the first response I'd like to make to what Peter brought up, and we mustn't forget the human side of it, because it's by introducing the human element that we run into problems by looking at assessment and accountability only through the lens of measurement. Measurement has a place in evaluation of schools, and the ministry has done a rather well-proportioned job of placing measurement into its general scheme of school accountability here in the province. But measurement can't get at a lot of the factors that are involved in the quality of a school. And that gets to one of my key concerns about the way the Fraser Institute and the Sun, in league with it with respect to the elementary school report card, reports on school quality. There are alternatives in terms of looking at schooling to determine quality that we see illustrated in other places in the world and here in British Columbia. For example, in terms of measurement, British Columbia and Canada are already subject to PISA and TIMS. And by these international measures, the schools in Canada, British Columbia, and Alberta rank at the very top of English language speaking schools anywhere in the world. But still, beyond the term of measurement, when we look at evaluation and accountability, we need to consider other models. For example, in the recent issue of Education Week, approximately 1 month ago, there's an extensive report on reforms that are taking place in Wales as to getting at how to better look at school quality in Wales now that they've been freed from the English system, the British system of accountability. And the article goes into great detail explaining how they get at factors involved in education which are not suitable for measurement. First of all, they've wiped away all standardized testing prior to the age of 14. And they put the responsibility on classroom teachers to make accountable measures accountable means of evaluation for their classrooms, and they brought those teachers together in what they call moderation, so standards are clearly embedded in the work that teachers are doing in giving grades. Now, this practice in Wales has been brought about by their observation that after 15 years of a severe measurement system, exclusively a measurement system as imposed upon them by the government in London, they were finding erosion of the quality of the schools in Wales in a number of the qualitative areas that they wanted to see preserved, like their culture, like their language, like their arts. And so their response has been to operate in this fashion. They will still use what is comparable to provincial exams toward the end of secondary school, and all in all, they have a system which rather resembles what's going on today in Manitoba, which has never left the traditional Canadian means of evaluating schools in favor of the more quantitative or measurement-based approach that we see now in British Columbia and Alberta. In Manitoba, similarly, teachers have the responsibility for evaluating what's going on in their classrooms, and then external evaluation takes place to determine whether teachers are maintaining sufficient standards in light of the testing that they're doing. So Manitoba has completely removed itself from the process of standardized testing. Another case in point of alternatives to measurement only is the government of Singapore, where one of our graduates, Alan Luke, was hired to manage a $40 million grant and 120 employees to look hard at the schools of Singapore to determine whether or not they were performing at maximum capacity. The Singaporeans said to Alan when he was hired that they are a country with approximately the same number of people as British Columbia, same number of students, but no natural resources, and human capital was the only method they had for advancing themselves economically. So they didn't want an ideological solution. They didn't want to follow anybody's model from elsewhere. They wanted to build something from the ground up through scientific observation of what really worked in classrooms. So Alan came in and used a combination of all sorts of evaluation tools and close observation of classrooms in order to elevate the performance in those schools. So I would recommend another alternative to demonstrate how schools can be meaningfully evaluated outside of merely measurement would be the current system in Singapore. I hear your watch beeping frantically. Does that mean I'm out of time?
You still have 40 seconds.
That's okay, I'll pass.
Rebuttal.
Well, it's interesting to speak of other systems that have adopted other methods. But, of course, the question you'll want to ask of the Singaporean system is on what basis will you determine whether or not the other methods work? I find it unusual and challenging that within a sector that is so important, that the understanding that measurement is in and of itself not the enemy, but a tool that can be used to help the practitioner ensure that this year they've done better, they've found better ways to address the needs of their kids than they did last year, and that they will be able better to plan how to make improvements in the following year. Speaking about the Canadian situation, you know, PISA, which we heard about, is dominated as far as the Canadian scene goes by Alberta, which has had the longest standing set of both the achievement tests, the same thing as the foundation skills, and the grade 12 provincial exams in the country. British Columbia now has, and has had for a fair time, the same similar kind of program. Not rigorous, I would say, but reasonable. Quebec has, on the secondary schools scene, had standardized testing or province-wide testing, and these three have dominated the PISA results over and I should point out, of course, that we don't have much of a time series with PISA. In fact, I think we only have 2 sets of valid data. Ontario, it is interesting, has also adopted testing at the grade 3, 6, 9 level, and at grade 10 as well. Given the measurements that we've made with regard to how Ontario has done since that testing system has come into place, I tend to believe that we will be seeing Ontario moving up the Canadian average as regards PISA. They have so many students, they are the Canadian average, but I see them as making substantial improvements in the level of achievement of kids in the basics, the reading, writing, and math. So again, the challenge is this. How do we know what we're doing? How do we know if we're improving without measurement?
Unfortunately here, Peter is implying that there's a connection between the testing that's gone on in these provinces and their performance in testing, but he isn't using any evidence to demonstrate that that's true. And that's one of the problems with the Fraser Institute approach. They make those kind of assertions, but they never draw the clear lines through scientific methodology that would stand up to peer review and the scrutiny of the scientific community in social science and education to make those claims stand up. This doesn't make it, and that's one of my main problems with the way the elementary school report card is reported in the Sun and by the Fraser Institute. The gloss or veneer of science is put on these claims, but real science isn't there. And we've gone and checked on that by having 2 of our professors and 2 of our graduate students working on the results of the Fraser Institute surveys for the last year and a half, and time after time we find flaws with the science itself. So this was an example of the assertion that the testing is causing the improvement in performance, and there's no evidence of that.
Well, gentlemen, you both agree that we should measure schools. You are similar in your motivation in terms of why, but how you disagree. So, Paul, you say the Fraser Institute rating is only a narrow dimension of school quality. What else should be evaluated in order to gauge the effectiveness of schools?
Elliot Eisner's concept of connoisseurship is probably, to me, the best comprehensive notion of how to evaluate schooling. It's supported by Robert State's notions on evaluation also, which get at a comprehensive view by trained persons who look at the entire school environment and share their professional expertise, much like a drama critic shares their expertise. We have elements of all of these things going on currently in British Columbia, because what's often lost in the debate about the report cards is that the Ministry of Education is attempting to have a comprehensive and broadly based accountability system, which everybody in this room lives with much more than I do. And I go over to the ministry to try and keep myself abreast of what they're doing, and I find much that's very commendable about their approach. Unfortunately, the report card takes one small element and uses it for a purpose for which it wasn't designed, and the Sun contributes to that by giving it a bully pulpit of an entire section of the newspaper each year, 29 pages or so, which are far out of proportion with the significance of that particular element in the accountability plan. So if you look at what the ministry is already doing of having school plans and visits by the minister and school parent consultations and parent satisfaction surveys and a spectrum of other things that are going on in order to determine the performance of a school, you know, as I say, because you're active participants in the system better than I, that comprehensive look is being made. Now, I did suggest when I spoke in October on the question of rethinking accountability of what further recommendations I would make. And looking at the international situation and what I know of evaluation, and I had the privilege of spending a Fulbright scholarship on the topic of evaluation, I would say that the missing element that we could use is a kind of inspection system, but avoiding the warts that are associated with the traditional British one. And the way I would suggest that we approach inspection is by using something that we've had at Simon Fraser for 40 years that's been very successful for us, which is the secondment of professionals to us for 2 years to do a role for us, which is teacher education. We second 60 teachers a year, and they work with our faculty to deliver teacher education. I would suggest if we want a more comprehensive and in-depth view of evaluation of schools in this province, we create a secondment inspection system that uses not just teachers, but principals and other stakeholders from across the groups, buys their time for a period of approximately 2 years so that they can go into schools and function as the expert consultants that Stake and Eisner and other experts in evaluation would say give the highest level of evaluation.
No matter what Paul believes, we at the Fraser Institute do not have a monopoly on the delivery of education with regard to school performance. Nor, I should say, would we want one. I mean, don't forget, the guy you see here started doing this as a parent, looking for information. And it's that simple. The report card has taken data that the Ministry of Education has in fact accumulated for different reasons, and after analysis has said these are good measures. And I don't think Paul has yet said that the measures that we have are bad. He's simply said there aren't enough of them, which, by the way, I would agree with entirely. But we've brought those together in a form that makes it easy for parents, primarily, who were, by the way, the target of the report cards in the first place, for parents to easily see. I would be delighted as a parent for others, other stakeholder groups, the Ministry of Education, the BC Teachers Federation, the Faculties of Education, to come up with other measures and other reports that parents could access as well. In fact, in our report card, each one of our report cards across the country, we tell parents to do just that in a number of different ways. We say, you know, this simply looks at how well the school is doing academically. We should be looking as parents for other sources of information. So I would encourage anyone who wishes to develop another source of education, another source of information, pardon me, to do just that for the good of the parents having the information, but also because I believe that the more information we have about how schools are operating, the more simple, the more easy it will be for educators to find new and better ways to do things. With regard to the claim that Paul has made with regard to how shall we say, the legitimacy of the report card. As I said, I haven't heard anyone saying that any of these particular measures in the elementary school or in the high school report cards are bad measures of what they do. You can agree or not on that. The method that we use to bring together all of the indicators into what we call the overall rating out of 10. The method is described in some detail in Appendix 1 of each of the report cards and has withstood considerable scrutiny by members of the Academy, both here and in the United States, as regards the methodology, as regards the implications of the methodology and so on, and have never been successfully challenged. No one has provided us or published a paper in a peer-reviewed journal or anywhere else that says these are the following 7 or 8 bad things about the report card's methodology. And then we saw cautions about rating BC's schools. And regrettably, the authors of that essentially took one small piece of the report card, the most recent year's overall rating out of 10, and said, this may not be the whole picture. Paul has and I thank him for it, shown that the Sun took 29 pages to display all of the information that we provided to them, including multiple years, multiple indices, a trend indicator, an overall rating out of 10, as well as contextual indicators, like parents' average education, percentage of ESL students in the school, percentage of special needs school, students in the school, and so on, that are given to provide some context for the results. But they chose to say, if you only look at the overall rating out of 10 for the most recent year, and for those of you familiar with this, that's this one number down in the 91 different data points. If you only look at that, you may not get the whole picture. We agree with him entirely. And that is, as I say, why we provide 29 pages of information for 1,009 elementary schools instead of 1.
Well, the other numbers aren't processed. They're just presented in a kind of raw form. And that trend category, I was looking at that today. Last year was the first year that appeared, and it isn't there in about 97% of the school rankings. It's something new they're working on, and as a public relations vehicle to talk about doing it's nice, but when you look at the rankings, it's hardly there at all. But one of our problems from the point of view of this meeting any kind of scientific credibility is those other factors like ESL, parental education, and so on are never used in the calculations of any rankings. They're just presented as raw data in there, left to the parent to wonder what to do with it. When Peter claims that the method has met scrutiny and so on, I want to see the evidence of that. I've seen no evidence that it's met any scrutiny. That's another one of these claims to veil the work in science that I don't think stands up. One of our questions is, why isn't this presented in a form that peers can review it? And we've been, as I say, using our own resources and volunteer time by professors to begin that review. And some of the things that we are concerned about are where it fails to meet scholarly standards. And I've told this to the Sun too, is it's reported without any discussion of reliability, without the weightings being justified. It's not a straightforward crunching of the FSA scores. There's gender gap and other factors introduced, but no clear rationale for doing that, and no alternative modeling demonstrated. There's no hypothesis that's argued for it as a piece of research, and there's a lack of use of any consultation with education researchers. Now, I don't mean to say that it could only be done by education researchers, but to perform An activity like this, and not to consult at all with education researchers or to have them as a part of the team, is a dubious way to approach this, because research in social science is a little more specialized than to bring in a generalist and have them work on any aspect of it. We also are concerned about, there's no, how much time do I have? 10 seconds? I'll save it for later.
Yeah, the fact of the matter is that I don't believe that Dr. Shaker has read these. To suggest that the trend indicators appeared all of a sudden, just recently, is wrong. There have been trend indicators in all of the report cards, British Columbia, Alberta, Ontario, and Quebec, that have been produced by the Fraser Institute in at least since 2001. Now, he says that most of these schools and most of the indicators in the report cards, these are the two current ones, don't have a trend indicator. That's absolute nonsense. The fact of the matter is there are 4 possible values for each indicator. It can either be improving relative to average, in which case there will be an upward pointing arrow. It can be declining relative to average, in which case there's a downward pointing arrow. There can be no statistically significant change over the 5 years, and we look at it over 5 years, in which case there is a dash. Or there can be not enough information to produce a trend, in which case there's an NA. Every single indicator, every single overall rating for every single school is analyzed where data are available over 5 years to determine whether or not there's any statistically significant improvement. This leads me to believe that Dr. Shaker has not read the text, or doesn't understand the text.
Gentlemen, you both have indicated that the Fraser Institute is a narrow ranking. I want to know what else you would include in this measurement index to round out the Fraser Institute ranking.
When we looked originally at producing a report card for the benefit of parents, we asked ourselves a number of questions, and the first one was, well, what kind of data could we use? Well, we would like to find data that shows something that's relevant to parents. We'd like to find data that is objective from the point of view that the measurement is not being made by the person or the organization that is measured. Third, we'd like it to be, we ask for that simply because, we believe in the strength and the vitality of a third-party objective measure. Third, we want the data to be comparable. That means that, if a number is 61.2, that generally that means the same thing, whether it's relevant or a result of a school in Prince George, or whether it's a result of a school in Mission. Fourth, we want the data to be annually generated so that we can provide the trends series that you see in the report cards, so that we can find out and report whether or not the school is improving or deteriorating over time. And finally, we'd like it to be, doesn't have to be, but we'd like it to be centrally available, so that rather than asking 1,009 schools all to deliver a certain set of data in the same format on the same day, we would go to the Ministry of Education, who has already received the stuff, and get it from them. Now, if we can find other data that looks at other aspects of schooling that meets those criteria, we'd be happy to include it. Let's look at some of them. Among many of the mission statements that I've read for schools is the development of citizenship skills. We are trying as a school to develop good citizens. This is something that we can and should measure. We are developing a desire for a healthy and active lifestyle among the students. This is something that for 2 years we've been able to measure using what we call, no doubt it's a proxy measure. It's not measuring exactly what we want, but it's good. It's called the sports participation rate. Regrettably, the very powers, it seems, who are arguing that we should have more results have decided not to give us that data anymore, as a result of a directive from the board of the BC School Sports Association. So, but that would be something I'd like to see. I would like to see transition data available so that we could get an idea of how well secondary schools are doing in terms of really preparing their students for success in post-secondary. So we'd like to know how they've done maybe 2 years into the post-secondary career. I'd like to know about fine arts. and whether or not kids are given sufficient or substantial opportunities to develop an appreciation of and a skill in the fine arts. I would like to know how trades training courses and programs within secondary schools have been able to or are effective in ensuring that the kids get on into an apprenticeship and succeed there. So we have a number of challenges, absolutely no question. Each and every one of those different areas of what goes on in schools, I think, is of value in terms of the students, certainly, and could be of great interest to the parents, and we should be developing indicators. With the help of everyone represented in this room, I think we can do it.
On the trends, my preliminary calculation, to say it more precisely, is not that, I should put it this way, the trend is that there is no trend in 97% of the cases that are reported in the document. That's why it puzzled me as to why this should be featured as a particularly significant datum at this point. Secondly, I want to remind you that Peter has not responded to my claims for him backing up his assertions about the scientific credibility of this work. I specifically have asked him to give the peers that have reviewed the document to show where the scrutiny has been made, because our evidence, as we examine the documents, is that it doesn't stand up to the standards of normal social science at the present time. One of the keys in this debate to this point is the term measure. And one of the things that I'm trying to do is to go into the realms of education that aren't easily measured or reduced to numbers. Measurement is not a cure, and measurement is not a comprehensive method for evaluation. Now, Peter much more favors a measurement approach, and that's his right. But one of my efforts in this debate is to expand our concept of what evaluation should be by discussing the other elements of a good evaluation system, as I have already done with the example of Wales and with the example of our own ministry. However, if you want to stick to measurement, then one of my concerns about the way the Fraser Institute report card is done and the way the Sun plays it is that there are many opportunities to do a higher level of quality of measurement than are done with this. The trend that is now appearing in the United States, reported on in Education Week in November, out of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the Department of Education, is to embed demographic measures into standardized tests so we can control for the cultural conditions and the previous experiences of students as they are taking these tests. So future NAPs are planned to have embedded within them factors such as the proportion of poor persons in the school catchment in which the test is being given, the percentage of single-parent families, the isolation index, that is, the number of times poor encounter only each other in a neighborhood, the dissimilarity index, the percentage needed in order to, percentage of poor people that would need to move from the neighborhood in order to change its demographics, the home resources that exist in these neighborhoods, and the concentration, duration, and depth of poverty in these neighborhoods. So far, research is showing in the U.S. And just so I'm not making claims that have no backing, Assessment of Educational Progress, AIM Institute is doing the research for the Department of Education, that these factors are better than free lunch, which has previously been the indicator used in order to control for demographics. One of my complaints when I visited the Sun was that they report these rankings without any control on the demographic conditions that the schools are representing. In California, where I had been previous to here for 6 years, there always were 2 columns of rankings reported. And the second column compared schools only with schools that were similar in terms of that free lunch figure, which is used so far in the U.S. as the best measure they have had of the human capital that exists in a school catchment. My question to the editors of The Sun has been, why don't they press the Fraser Institute for a more sophisticated reporting of the data that takes into account a number of these other factors that are readily available right here and now, and that our researchers are currently using to look again at the data that Fraser Institute's creating the report card out of, like parental educational level, like mobility rates, like ESL, like special needs children in the school, like class size. Now, as Peter's saying, many of these are reported in the boxes, but they're not figured in the rankings or the calculations. There doesn't need to be just one set of rankings from 1 to 1,000. There could be 4, 5, or 6 sets of rankings depending on which factors you thought needed to be weighted. And of course, the more sophisticated way now that we see emerging in the U.S. is to embed the demographic factors in the examination so you get a clear idea of who you're testing and what they brought to the school, so you can take a meaningful value-added approach to schooling rather than just comparing scores between schools as they change from year to year without that value-added dimension being factored in.
There's so much meat here. It's too bad we didn't have... Paul, have you got a week?
Well, I thought we were going to go on the road with this.
Peter and Paul on the road.
We'll pick Ron, too.
There you go. And Ron.
Be merry.
Peter, Paul, and Ron. I'm encouraged to hear what Paul says. I believe there should be more rankings. But I have an issue with whether or not we should modify the results on the basis of parent and student characteristics. And I have a substantial concern there. After all, when the kids leave school and they go to their first job interview, the fact that they are sprung from recent immigrants from Honduras, and the fact that they had very little schooling before they got to Canada and not the required number of years when they finally arrived, will not factor into the decision that the employer makes as to their employability. It will likely not factor into the decision that the admissions officers at Simon Fraser University use to determine who gets into the Faculty of Education and who doesn't. But I agree with the idea of having more than one indicator. While I strongly suggest that there should be an indicator of, so to speak, the absolute level of achievement, what we often do, and one of them is available within the BC Secondary Schools report card, is actually have indicators of how well the school is doing given, in this case, parental education. It's there. In other jurisdictions, while we don't have one yet in BC, in other jurisdictions we have what we call value-added measures, which essentially do what Paul is talking about. And finally, in BC, we have an online report card, only now for the secondary schools, which allows anybody who wants to go and look at it to compare schools with similar characteristics, including parents' average education, size, whether it's rural or not, ESL students, that sort of thing. So we're going there. With Paul's help, we can go faster.
Does public ranking improve or harm the efforts of schools to get better?
Oh, well, I thought I was going to get a 2-minute to talk about what happens when you look at these correlations. For example, there's no correlation whatsoever with parental satisfaction. We've just had a recent PhD look at that in terms of the Fraser Institute report card and the Parental Satisfaction Index, a public policy PhD. There's no correlation whatsoever between the Fraser Institute rankings and parental satisfaction as monitored by the ministry. There's a highly significant medium correlation with parental educational levels. 30% of the variance in the Fraser Institute rankings can be correlated at a significant level with parental educational levels, which leads us to wonder, if we went into some of these other demographic figures, if we wouldn't find an explanation to the whole ranking system. And a value-added approach that we have implemented by using the writing scores, which have been in a constant mode of reporting for the past several years, brings 11 public schools into the top 20. When you look at value added instead of the approach that Fraser's taking, then 11 public schools come into the top 20. So it makes a lot of difference what you look at, and that's why I have complained to the Sun and to Peter in a collegial way that the science isn't adequate, and the costs, which is what Ron's getting at, are substantial. For example, we know that there's cheating going on. I get calls from teachers that I then forward to the ministry about schools and the cheating that's going on, and I don't want to say that it's particularly either public or private. We see that in 2 of the top 20 schools,
But you will. Sorry.
No, I'm not going to say, because the ministry's job is to look into it. We see that in the 2 highly ranked schools, which were featured in the Sun's inner city school top of the class rankings, in one of them, 47% of the students didn't take the FSAs, and in the other, 83% of the students didn't take the FSAs. Now, what is happening here, and I've told this to the ministry, is a movement of parental nullification. Parents, politically savvy enough to know that the FSAs are being used for purposes not approved of by the ministry, the minister, or any other professional stakeholder group in education, are withholding their children from these tests. So that's a cost of using these tests in an inappropriate way. Narrowing of the curriculum has been the phenomenon that has occurred in the United States with things that aren't easily measurable, like some of the things that Peter mentioned, like the arts, being removed from the curriculum along with recess. A demoralization of teachers and students, which has been gone into beautifully in the Mark Kelly CBC report, which we have the URL for if any of you want to look at it, if you missed it on CBC, who went up to Prince Rupert and went to one of the absolute lowest ranked schools, and Gary Mason's column from last summer, which was reprinted in Teacher magazine in the fall, saying what he saw when he went out to schools. Now, this is a testament to what happens when you go out and spend time in schools, which is what I have told the people at the Sun and other persons who are concerned, whether they're in politics or in business, if they really want to get a sense of the schools, go out and visit the schools. And in both cases, with Kelly and with Mason, and believe me, if you look at Mason's column in June before he went out and visited schools, it was not favorable to my point of view. But after he went out and spent time in a school, I wish I had time to read the closing words of it there, touching and cut to the quick about the demoralization that is occurring when you take a school like that where people are working at their best capacities and humiliate them by putting them in the bottom 1,007 out of 1,007 schools. So there are costs. The shaming and blaming that we see it eats at our ability as professional people to keep credibility in the community and keep our own spirits up. One of the reasons I left the United States as an educator, I didn't want to ask young people to come into education anymore. That was my personal feeling. At this point in my career, I'd had enough with No Child Left Behind, which is the logical extension of the Fraser Institute approach, and I didn't feel in conscience I wanted to recruit young people into teaching. Finally, it is what Linda McNeil calls an Enronization of education. It is like Enron did with stock price. There was nothing behind that company but stock price. And this reliance on a single indicator measurement is the same kind of thing that leads to phoniness. It corrupts the structure of the institution. It demoralizes people. And it's just flat out in scientific terms wrong.
Peter, does public ranking improve or harm the efforts of schools to get better?
Will you applaud when the Faculties of Education, the British Columbia Teachers Association, the BC Principals and Vice Principals Association, the BC School Boards Association, and the BC Trustees Association say, we have a report card that ranks schools in a different way, a more holistic way? Because that's what Paul has said would be an answer. And I'm suggesting that since the first report card of the Fraser Institute came out in March of 1998, that with the exception of the BCTF STAR program, which never got off the ground, there has been not one initiative to develop a rigorous measure of how schools are doing. And I would point out that, you know, I would imagine that the three folks who from the Simon Fraser faculty who wrote this critique, weak as it is, of the Fraser Institute report cards, would probably suggest to Dr. Shaker that they could not use the parental satisfaction numbers from the Ministry of Education because that would not be statistically possible. However, are there benefits and disadvantages of this kind of reporting? Sure. Mark Kelly went to visit Roosevelt Elementary School. Mark Hume went to visit Roosevelt Elementary School. Peter Cowley went to visit Roosevelt Elementary School. That's the one they're talking about that scored a 0 back in June. The school has substantial challenges. There's absolutely no question about it. But I would ask you, have a look at the Mark Kelly video with your critical thinking skills on and talk about what the message was. I mean, we took a reporter from the national CBC News and we put him in a school, and in 7 days he didn't know how to teach people. Does that surprise anyone? Hardly think so. But the point is, Roosevelt has some substantial challenges. The report card provides ample evidence of that, and it hurts. I've been in this business, as I say, since 1998, putting out these report cards, authoring these report cards. And I have had the occasion to be the brunt of anger, tears, sorrow, a feeling of distress and diminishment from some very good people. What I believe that they misunderstand is that in a ranking, no one is saying that the people at the low-rated schools are bad people. No one is saying that they are bad teachers. No one is saying that they're not giving their all for the people for whom they're dedicated. But I have to ask them one question, and I asked this of the principal at Roosevelt. Given the kind of students, given the characteristics of the student body that you serve, do you know of any schools who serve similar student bodies who are doing a better job than you are? And by that, I simply mean being more effective in the delivery of education as evidenced in objective results. And if you do know, what contact have you made with those schools so as to assure yourself that they are doing nothing that you aren't already doing in terms of programs, in terms of approaches for the better success of their kids? And if there are none in BC, have you looked in Alberta? I had the distinct pleasure and honor to be involved in the Garfield Weston Awards for Excellence in Education back in November on the 8th in Calgary, where the most improved school in Alberta, still by the way ranking 0, had shown such extraordinary improvement over the last 5 years that it was given the award as the most improved school at the Basket Delta Community School in Fort Chipewyan. Virtually all Aboriginal students, mostly First Nations, substantial problems within the community, and yet a team which, having gotten 0 on the report card, was exhilarated, was thrilled beyond belief that their efforts and their results had been recognized. And they'd come a long way over the 5 years. They had a lot longer to go, but they were ready for the job.
Movement is against ranking. Ranking along with measuring is not a cure-all. To think that measuring or ranking is a cure-all for evaluation or an appropriate language for comprehensive evaluation of schools is a misperception. It can't be done. It's an improper use of social science terminology. That's one of the basic differences between Peter and myself. But if you're going to do rankings, at least do rankings with some credibility. At least meet the scientific standards and check and employ as variables the other things that are right before you. This determination to stay with one simplistic ranking in the face of all this other data is amazing to me. And it's amazing to me that the Sun accepts such a low standard in what they give so much space in the newspaper to. It's unprecedented that you see such a simplistic kind of ranking used to such an extent in the media. And it troubles me that the Sun has no ombudsperson or public editor who can call the editors to account and look more deeply into this issue as the public editor would do at the New York Times, and inform them of the distortion of information that they're presenting. That's an organization, by the way, CanWest, whose mission statement says it is there to educate and enlighten. This is the furthest thing from enlightenment, to misuse the terminology of science and to distort the story of the schools of British Columbia, some of the finest schools in the English-speaking world, and not to seem to care to do a better job. And believe me, a better job wouldn't cost that much money to do. The tendency is away from these rankings. I don't know if you realize that 18 universities now pulled out of the Maclean's rankings. Simon Fraser was in the first group of 11 along with UBC. And now it's up pushing 20. Universities have pulled out of the Maclean's rankings, which are more sophisticated statistical attempt to rank universities than the report card is of the schools, but nonetheless, the universities finally have put their foot down and realized that it was corrupting to the delivery of their services, that they were being driven by these single indicators and narrowing factors. It was corrupting to their ability to deliver the best higher education. And higher education in Canada, you know, isn't just a business for Canada. It's a tremendous resource for the world and brings a great many people here for the purchase of those services.
Thank you.
Response. I'm sorry, I am guilty of not answering a substantial and important part of the previous question, and that is with regard to the inclusion. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't think I did answer with regard to the inclusion of socioeconomic or contextual factors within a ranking. We can do that. All in favor? Rank schools on the basis of results conditioned by those factors which are seen to be or are determined to be statistically significant and drawn from percentage of lone parents in the family, which we have, only an estimate, but a good one, percentage of ESL students in the school, percentage of Aboriginal students in the school, income of the parents, et cetera, et cetera. Percentage of families who have been, whose home language is not English and have been in the country for less than a year is also available. We can do that. The calculation would be much like the value-added calculations that you'll see in Alberta elementary and high schools and in the Ontario ones and in the Quebec report card. Who wants that? And as I say, you know, we have to remember what the report card is all about. The report card is intended to provide parents with one source of objective data with regard to how schools are doing. Paul has other ways he believes the school performance should be measured. I give him absolute support in proceeding with that. Why shouldn't I? We want information for the people who are most interested, for the educators, for the parents, for the taxpayers.
Thank you, Peter. Peter, you have just been appointed the Minister of Education. What are you going to do to improve schools?
Well, I can guarantee you I will not soon be appointed Education Minister. The Education Roundtable would look, well, I don't think anyone would come to the Education Roundtable, but that's another issue. Maybe they would, who knows. I must tell you, that's a topic for another day. I'm going to cop out on that one because that is very little to do with measurement. Well, maybe I won't cop out on it. Is it possible that we're not doing enough testing? Many folks who and this as Minister of Education I would ask. I would ask the stakeholders, but particularly the educators and the administrators in schools that traditionally do not fare well. Because many of those folks that we've heard about here will say to me, it's not that you have a ranking, it's not that you're rating schools, it's that your measurement's wrong. What you're doing is you're measuring how the kids did. And just like Paul said, you're not measuring how the kids did given their circumstances, or, and this is, I believe, far more important, how much progress has, we have a leaking roof, how much progress has the average student in this school made over the last year? This seems to me like an extraordinarily powerful measure of the effectiveness of schools. Take the baseline of kids that you have. Parents, after all, send you the best kids they can, I suppose, theirs, and take the baseline measure of how they're doing now, pre-test, beginning of the year, when they get into school. And then test them again at the end. I mean, this sounds like Canadian Test of Basic Skills to me. Test them again at the end and see if they've had any development. Determine the average level of development of the kids at the school. Rank the schools on the basis of that. I'd ask people about that. Those are the kinds of things that I would talk about as Minister of Education. I would say, well, how can we do a better job of improving? How do we know which of our schools have found effective ways to do things that others maybe don't? How much networking are we actually doing? You know, this can be an enormous networking tool. All right? Seems to me that it should be almost a roadmap. I mean, if the people in Nishka want to find out how schools with Aboriginal students are doing in the Pacific North, in the northeast of the province, one way they can do it is to look here, especially if they use the online version, which allows them to filter schools on the basis of student and family characteristics. What we need, I think, is, and maybe this is the thing I wasn't going to say. You know, in a recent commentary to the media, Dr. Shaker talked about himself and his cohorts in the faculty of his cohort, his colleagues in the faculty of education as being defenders of public education. As the dean of one of our major education faculties, I would have, as he is the dean, I would have rather heard him say that he is a defender of education of the public. Education of the public being a cornerstone of democracy, which, by the way, John Ralston Saul and I agree on, as long as you change the terminology from public education as the cornerstone to education of the public. They would be the same in a Google search. I think, you know, as Minister of Education, I'd like to open things up a little bit. I'd like to open education up a little bit to people and organizations who maybe have a different way of doing things, who maybe are willing to try different methods, maybe even willing to adapt methods that have proven successful in other countries, maybe even willing to operate schools in British Columbia as clones, if you will, of schools that have shown themselves to be successful in other areas. I'd open it up.
Well, you're Minister of Education.
Yes, yeah. 5 minutes about what my whole life's been about thinking about. First, let me say something else that Peter and I are sympathetic to one another about are public charter schools, which KIP is an example of in the United States, and the founder of KIP was brought to the banquet honoring, is that a Weston Awards banquet? Yes. The Weston Awards banquet that I attended and heard him speak. Public charters are a good example of a way to get alternative pathways in education and still keep all the values of public education in place. This new movie, Freedom Writers, which I'm looking forward to seeing, is another example of the kind of innovation that took place in a public school in Long Beach, enough that it has been transformed into a film. Now, the basic question that Ron's asking is the question that Phil Winnie and John Nesbitt, our professors who have been working with me on this, have presented, and that is what should be done. Once all the measuring is over with, what should be done? That's one of the problems with the report card not starting off with a hypothesis, because when all the dust is settled and we look at the results, we're just left to a kind of impressionistic viewing and weighing of things anecdotally, rather than having seen that a hypothesis has been tested. If you ask me what should be done, the very first priority, and this is what I speak about when I talk to the stakeholder groups here in the province, is we need to make a concentrated effort to reassert the value of professionals in our society here in BC. Not just teaching and education professionals, all professionals. Because a lot of what's going on here in the newspaper and through this report card is an assault on professional values and professional ethics. The fact that the Sun will blithely ignore the protests of the minister, the ministry, and every professional education stakeholder group when they say to the Sun that what they are doing is not a service to education, that it is in fact a kind of disinformation, the fact that they can ignore all of that blithely without really even making an effort to check what we're talking about by hiring their own impartial people to scrutinize it is an example of disrespect for the profession. For us in the profession, this is not just a game or not even just a job. We have a professional and moral responsibility. We are bound by our ethics that whether we find things we agree with or not in the research we do, we have to report them forward and act on our findings. And so when I come to you tonight, for example, in this debate. I'm doing that out of a sense of professional responsibility. And my great fear in our society, particularly vis-a-vis education, but you see it in other fields too, is an erosion of the significance of professions in society. A great example of this is the RCMP challenge to the Insight Safe Injection Center that was reported on around the 12th of December in the Globe first, in a very detailed article, which I think was a very remarkably detailed and accurate article, and then in an editorial in The Sun. Now, if you replace education with medicine and medical research in this editorial, then The Sun would be postulating to you exactly what I'm trying to argue for, which is they took the Mounties to task over claiming that science existed when it was really just opinion, and it was something that that organization was particularly interested in putting forward. If you would hold the Fraser Institute report card to the same standard that The Sun wants to hold the Mounties to in the Insight case, then I would have no complaint at all with the newspaper. So the first thing that I would do in our society would be to remind people of what professions are about, that they are specially trained people entrusted with special powers, held to a higher standard of ethics, self-governing, and in return for that they give specialized services to society, and they should at least be given the benefit of the doubt when they say something is wrong or out of order. They should at least be seriously considered in their opinions and not put aside as if they were just simply a man in the street, which is what's been happening with this report card with respect to the Vancouver Sun.
With regard to the overall rating out of 10, quote, while each of the indicators is important, it is almost always the case that any school does better on some indicators than on others. So, just as a teacher must make a decision about a student's overall performance, we need an overall indicator of school performance in the tables called overall rating out of 10. Just as teachers combine test scores, homework, and class participation to rate a student, we have combined all the indicators to produce an overall rating. This overall rating of school performance answers the question, in general, how is the school doing academically? Now, I would suggest that the critique that we've heard tonight is not a critique of a report card whose aim is suggested in those words. It's a critique of, in fact, the very idea that we should assume that one school may possibly do a better job than another, and that it's important to find out which ones are, not just for the parents who use the report card when they're choosing a school, when they're maybe coming to a neighborhood as one source of information, not just for the parents who are provided with an annual audit of how their children's school is doing, not just for the taxpayers who, as a group, including those who aren't parents, foot the bill, and not just for educators, but for everybody. How's the school doing academically? Now, if Dr. Shaker would like to approach the Vancouver Sun with a better way of doing that, because that appears to be a question that parents are interested in, then he should do so. He shouldn't complain to them about this report card. He should provide a better one that the Sun in its wisdom may choose. There's absolutely, again, we don't have a monopoly on this stuff. Anyone who wants to produce a better widget, let's have them do it. I mean, of all people, that's what the Fraser Institute is interested in seeing done. More competition in reports or measurements, if you don't like the word.
Thank you, Peter.
Well, again, measuring and ranking I don't see as comprehensive responses to judging school quality. And we are investing in, and we may report some kind of data to the Sun to concretize the arguments I've been making. But we aren't going to rank the schools from 1 to 1,000. We just aren't going to do it. Let me read to you the last paragraph in Gary Mason's column about Prince Rupert. Factors the Fraser Institute's rankings don't take into account, which is why the lousiest school in the province may just be the best. His point here is that from what he saw in that school and the progress that was being made and the sacrifice of time and energy that was being placed in it, the school might be the best and not the worst, and that is how far off the rankings might actually be. So we're not talking about whether the school should have been 990 or 1,000. Given the context they're working in and the progress they're making in that community and the value they are to those children, it may be the best school. So that's why measuring and ranking can't tell the story as should be told. And the methodology that we're seeing put before us, to quote Marshall McLuhan, the medium is the message. When you give an entire section of the newspaper every year to these rankings, just being done on one set of dimensions, you're sending a powerful message to the public of the Lower Mainland and British Columbia. It's a message that certain people want to see sent, that these have a kind of face validity and power and deserve attention by persons. The paper is the second largest selling paper of the year for the Vancouver Sun. That's what the editor-in-chief told me. That's why they're loath to change what they're doing with it. But to claim then that it's only one indicator and it shouldn't be overused as they did in their editorial, and as Peter does, to his credit, doesn't comport with the magnitude of the presentation of it. Now, to give you an example of what I'm talking about, okay, we'll try and get it later.
And now it's your turn, friends. We're going to entertain a few questions. I like the questions to be short and to the point rather than a statement. And we'll give each one of our panelists the opportunity to respond to those questions in short answer form. If you'd like to come up to the microphone so everybody can hear you, and tell us who you are.
I'm Pat Truelove. I'm a classroom teacher. A little nervous. A quick observation then, if Dr. Cowley and Dr. Shaker could respond, please. As a classroom teacher, I've administered the Foundation Skills Assessment Test very often, which is one of the principal indicators upon which the report card is based. And kids, they're not stupid. The first thing they want to know when you give them a test is, does it count for my report card? Does it count? That's what's meaningful to them. No, it doesn't, kids. Oh, well, they don't care. The test becomes a joke. Some try, some don't. I've also been involved in the marking at the ministry level too, and it's very apparent that what you're getting is not real data. So I'd like to know how we can possibly even debate this question about the methodology and the statistics and the rest of it when the data that you're getting is nonsense.
Paul?
Sometimes bribes are paid. My home state of Ohio, I read in the paper today, is paying $100 to each student that performs at a certain level. And they have for some years now given a $500 scholarship to students in high school who take the so-called voluntary test. I know this because one of my friends has a child with cerebral palsy, and she declined the scholarship because she didn't want to subject her daughter to another one of these tests that she wouldn't do well on because she has a handicap in a certain subject area. So that's one answer, but it's really, I'd leave that question more to experts in psychometrics. I don't know how you get people to invest deeply in tests if they're not related to their grade.
Peter?
I'd be disappointed to think that professionals in the teaching business would do that. Well, you know, I mean, I got the impression, oh, by the way, the questioner actually referred to me as Dr. Cowley, and I'd like to put it on the record that I do not have a PhD in anything. So you can just call me Peter. But you know, the idea that tests are not taken seriously, that and we've heard rumors, for instance, I'm sure you all have, of instructors in the classroom situation making it abundantly clear that the test is either not to be put on, you know, doesn't go to their grade, nor is there any particular reason why you need to give it your best shot. I would think, and maybe I'm wrong, I would think that the majority of teachers say, look, I mean, this is an assessment to help you, to help your teacher find out how you're doing. As a result, no, you don't have to stay up late at night to study, but, you know, you should do your best. That's pretty easy. Now, with regard to the marking, you know, again, I'm afraid that I have to leave the quality of the marking to the guidance or the oversight of the Ministry of Education. I presume, although I don't know all the details, that markers are hired. You know, and I doubt that they use volunteers. For that, presumably, there is some expectation that the markers will do a reasonable job. I know that in Quebec, and I don't know what the situation is here, but I know that ministry officials do audits on test results to see if they're comparable across district, across days of the week and so on. And I would presume that there are some reasonable measures in place to ensure that this is true. On the other hand, say there were some malfeasance or some laxness in the process, one would expect that would be randomly distributed across the schools, in which case the averages would reflect that. And you would still have substantial variations between schools, which is what these tests are intended to measure, is whether or not there are systemic differences between schools. So I believe that in the end we always get back to the idea of, well, this is no good, let's throw it out and replace it with nothing. Well, I mean, there may be a few cheers in this room for that. I can tell you that last year 95,000 copies, PDF copies of components of the BC elementary school, the secondary schools report card were downloaded. Now, they weren't all downloaded by teachers. I think most of them were downloaded by parents. This is information that parents want to know. I'd be happy to work with anyone who'd want to improve what we're providing parents with. But to suggest, and I still haven't heard from Paul what he would replace this with as far as what it's for. That is to provide understandable information to parents.
Thanks, Bill. Next question.
Good evening. My name is Bruce Biersto. I'm superintendent of schools in Richmond. I think the questions posed were good ones. I think there is a deep intricacy underneath the specific issue here that has to do with how we live in a public space and how we get information to each other and what we measure and what it means. And it's too deep for me to touch, even if I understood it. So I have a much simpler question. I know that the Sun will continue to do this, and I know that parents will continue to read it, and I know they will continue to apply meaning. And I know the meaning they apply. 6 is better than 7, 7 is better than 8. And whatever the caveats, many parents do that. I know this because the day after the things come out, the elementary school in Richmond that comes out at the top that year has 15 parents lining up, I want to sign up, you're the best school. The next year that is in the middle of the ranking, and another school is at the top, and the parents are there. And the sort of volatility of the ranking is of interest to me. So my question is a very simple one. You have sophisticated statisticians working on this, and you have many years of data. Could you and would you add a confidence interval or standard of error to the ranking so that one could distinguish, whatever the merits of the ranking, and we can debate that, just could distinguish when there was actually a difference. Is it different to be 10th to 30th? Is that statistically significant? How far apart do you have to be to have any meaning, whatever the merits of the measure itself? Because to me, I think that might help parents who are looking for a very simple answer to a very complex question, for which I don't blame them because they're vitally concerned with their kids. It would help them to think about it and help us to talk to them about it if we had this error bar. And have you done that, and how big would it be?
Yeah,
Do you want this one?
it might come as a surprise to some folks, but we've thought long and hard about these things. And we spent nearly a year designing the first one. And we decided not to include estimates of error. Instead, what we decided to do was not rank schools in isolation 1 year at a time. In many cases you'll see a ranking, and I think maybe the league tables in England do this, that is simply the rank of how the schools did this year. And when you do that, and when you ask people to imply from that one number what will happen in a school in coming years, you are liable to them for any inconsistencies that result as a result of the fact that that might have been an anomalous year. It might have been a little bit higher than average, it might have been a little bit lower for that school, but if you only look at that one piece of data, then, and if we only published one set of data, 1 year worth of data, we would very likely, I could say almost certainly, include an error bar. as they do in the PISA tests when you see the test. It's just 1 year of results. But we have a time series, and we believe that it's a better way of showing how a school will actually do in future by asking the question, over a period of time, how is it done? And what kind of variability do you see from year to year? I mean, if you, for instance, see a school that's 10 one year, a 3.2 the next year, a 7.8 in the following year, a 5.1 then, and a 6, you'll say, you know, first off, you'll see that there's no statistically significant change in it in the report card. But you'll also say, how can we, with this kind of variability, make any kind of assessment of how the school is going to do next year? And the answer is you can't. But on the other hand, if you find a school where you have 5 years of data, and it's very even, or very much even. I'm looking at Bon Accord Public Elementary School, 6.2 in 2000, 6.1, 6.9, 6.7, 5.6, 6.5. There's a band there, you know, and you can see it obviously. So we decided, for the basis of clarity and certainty, the best that we can do is to provide a number of years of results. So that, and these results, by the way, are why it's 29 pages. I mean, if we just did a ranking, they could do it in a page and a half. We provide that so that people can see, not just on the indicators, but also on the overall rating, how is this school doing over time? And that's a much better measure, we feel, or a much better predictor of how it's going to do in future than would simply be one score with one set of confidence interval.
Well, this illustrates a problem that came up early in the talk of picking and choosing, cherry-picking things from the scientific lexicon and determining on your own what you're going to use and what you're going to dismiss. That's why you have peer review. That's why you submit what you do when you do work like this to others who have training and who are objective and who determine whether or not it's credible. You can't just choose whether to use these tests or not and then claim that what you've done is scientific. The question that Superintendent Bairstow is asking is a vital question if you're going to make any sense of these data. Also, it is a question that the Winnie Nesbitt-Gress report went into, which Peter alluded to earlier, and which would be available to you on our website, and which I have sent out to about 500 influential people around the province because the Sun wouldn't publish it, although it was written explicitly for them and offered to them first in an exclusive arrangement. 1,800 words to try to explain these kind of concepts of why the science is defective. So it gets back to early in the debate when I questioned associating anything to do with this report card with the notion that it is contemporary social science.
And final question. It's yours.
My name is Susan Johnson. I'm also from Richmond. I hadn't meant to directly follow Bruce, but I did. So I guess I would say that I, like most people in this room, like probably all of people in this room, care about public education. I care about success for individual students, and I care about the success of my school. I'm a school principal. Where I get stuck, though, is in the public energy that is used up on data that I find to be somewhat simplistic. And Peter, you did say that you would be delighted if other stakeholder groups would develop and share more data, and I really do believe you when you say that. I wonder if your institute is familiar with and has tried to get a handle on the performance standards data that's available throughout the province, because that is a chunk of data that's really quite rich. It's not easy to collate, and it's not easy to get a handle on through statistics, but it's incredibly rich and well detailed in terms of what it describes. And I wonder if your institute has had a look at that, and if you have any comments about that, please.
Well, to the best of my knowledge, this is not a data set that could be used to characterize how effective individual schools are doing. But, you know, well, you know, I can tell you that we haven't looked at it from that view, because I've looked at it as another kind of a tool, a different kind of a tool, but it's certainly something we'd look at. You know, as I said, if it meets those 5 criteria, starting with relevance, then why wouldn't we look at it? We have no interest in producing a narrowly focused report card. None.
I wasn't going to respond to that.
What I'm going to do is give each of our speakers this evening 3 minutes to summarize their final viewpoints on the whole issue of how do we measure schools. Would you like to go first, Paul?
I'm interested in the what I would call the deep answers to why these things happen, to why this kind of information has such purchase on the public imagination. And one explanation I found in the March 2005 CAPN, in an article written by the distinguished presidential scholar in residence at ETS, the Educational Testing Service. So this is not a person who's against measurement or testing. And the thesis of his article is that there are, and he uses physics as a comparison, there are a certain amount of what he calls phenomenological primitives that non-experts attach to, like heavier objects fall faster than lighter objects, and the sun goes around the earth. You can see it every morning come up in the east and go down in the west. And there's a set of those that pertain also in education as they would in medicine or any other field that people attach themselves to. And unless professionals and the media are not on guard to help people see past these things, they get trapped in logical fallacies and non-scientific science, and the consequences that follow from that are to be expected. He lists 9. I'll just tell you 3. One is a test measures what it says in the title. In other words, if it says it's an intelligence test, then by God, you don't have to go any further. It's an intelligence test. Secondly, a test is a test is a test. And this is one of the ones that pertains to the report card. The Foundation Skills Assessment Test was not designed for what it's being used for by the Fraser Institute. And that is an example of using one of these P-prims or phenomenological primitives to distort the language of science, to give misinformation under a cloak of science. And finally, a score is a score is a score. And this is one of the other things that I've been debating with Peter about tonight, that they give one score that's of dubious credibility, that's not backed up by normal scientific checks on reliability and error of measurement, and they act as though that score had some particular significance over a dozen other scores that we could list. Any score is good enough. And I've seen this in action all the way to the top levels of government when I was in California. The Secretary of Education of California said to me, any test is better than no test for the purpose of ranking schools. So these things are not just out there in the abstract. They are deeply embedded in people who are in powerful roles in our society. So it's just up to people like myself who have a professional responsibility to try to come to forums like this one and explain why this really shouldn't be the way we make educational decisions.
I think we're there to the nuts and bolts. The question is not whether or not, I think the question is whether or not we should rank schools, not whether we should measure them. It's not a question of whether or not schools should decide on mechanisms by which to determine whether they're improving and all that sort of thing. The question has boiled down really, I think, this evening to whether or not the Sun should publish rankings from the Fraser Institute or rankings from anyone else. Because I think it was clear, Paul made it clear, that he would not rank schools. He wouldn't rank schools on the basis of metrics embedded in which were the socioeconomic characteristics of the students. So we boil down to an agreement to disagree on the benefit to students of ranking schools. Dr. Shaker believes that they should not be ranked. I believe that there are ample examples in a variety of different areas of human endeavor that competition, evidence of competition and excellence through rankings, the use of measurement to help improvement, all these kind of things are fundamental to what we want to do, and that is yearly have better schools. I find it remarkable that if ranking, competition, and measurement are considered anathema to the education of students, I find it remarkable that in the schools that I've gone into, usually on the the right-hand side is the principal's office, and the left-hand side is the trophy case. I have yet to meet a high school track coach who does not measure his individual sprinters' results. I have yet to meet a high school track coach who does not share with his various sprinters techniques for getting out of the blocks. And yet, when it comes to the evaluation of schools, all of a sudden we do an about-face. And we say, no, ranking's a bad thing. Oftentimes, you know, when I was in business and we were concerned about continued competition and viability of our businesses, we often said the bad news is the good news. And I believe that very much to be true when it comes to rankings. I believe that the principal of Roosevelt Elementary, I believe that the principal up in Salmo, who 7 or 8 years ago found himself at the bottom of the table, the rankings, actually value the rankings. They value it from the point of view that it crystallizes focus on the school, and it energizes people to do something. And that's the issue. The issue is not, and it's interesting because a couple of weeks ago I reviewed a presentation made by Dr. Shaker to the Accountability Convention, and in it he said an important thing, and I can't paraphrase because I don't remember exactly, but he said it's not really where you are or what the result is, but what you do as a result of that result. If you wish to be demeaned by getting a 0, then your students will suffer. If you, on the other hand, see that 0 for what it is, on this measure, no other school in the province performed at the same level. If you use that as an incentive to bring together all the forces, all the energy, all the excitement, all the innovation that you possibly can to find a way to do better, then I think the ranking has shown precisely what it does in all these other areas. It is worthwhile, it is useful, and it's a benefit to kids.
Thank you. I'd just like to thank both gentlemen for an intelligent, thoughtful, articulate, and at times emotional debate. I thought they did an outstanding job. Thank you very much.
So on behalf of all your BCASCD executive, I have the gift this evening of thanking our fabulous speakers. And I'm going to actually frame my thank you within the framework of critical literacy. Before I go into that, I would really appreciate you joining me. And within the framework of critical literacy, how important it is for all of us to be inviting all perspectives and figuring out what voice isn't heard and ensuring that we hear that. And I would really like you to join me in thanking Peter, and our wonderful intellectual companion, Paul from SFU. Would you please join me in thanking him? And you can thank me when I'm done. I'm the voice of Mary. And thank you so much, because it is so important for us to engage in that intellectual dialogue, to be pushed to think about all of our perspectives, and also to think deeply about schools. And I just bring a perspective to thank you from the perspective of being the worker in the field. And to say that for us, and I think I speak for many of us this evening that says, much of what counts, we actually have a hard time measuring. And I heard this evening around the focus on academics, and for many of us, we are so passionate about ensuring that our children are empathetic, that our children have a moral and ethical lens when they're making decisions. And so actually, to all of you tonight, just for us, that matters to us. Would you agree with me? You have to clap now. And also for us, as a humble servant of the schools, actually we're not really concerned about how we rank as schools. We actually really are not. What we are concerned about is making a difference to every child in that school, to making a difference and to ensuring that all children have success, and to make a difference every day in the lives of every kid that walks through that door. And actually for us, and we so invite the debate tonight, but there's another piece for us, and it's a deepening of the dialogue and a deepening of the thinking about who are those kids that we're not making a difference for, and not only who they are, but how do we identify them and what do we do to make a difference. So we appreciate your perspectives, and we just want to make sure that you have ours, because every day of our lives when we walk in those schools, what is it that we can do to make a difference to every one of their lives? So we thank you tonight, and we are curious that one of the measurements we care very deeply about is classroom assessment based on teacher judgment, because at the end of the day, if you ever want to know how our kids are doing, it's quite simple. You just have to ask those teachers who every single day and with all due respect, I know you know this, but there is no one indicator that can ever tell you that, because that teacher standing up there, working with those kids every day of their lives for 10 months of the years, knows how those kids are doing, knows how to make a difference, and they work at it every single day they walk into that school. So we thank you humbly for being here this evening, and we passionately tell you we know what we're doing, and we will make a difference.